Now, having become an asylee or a refugee, what are your rights? And the rights I'm talking about are not rights to bring a lawsuit or rights or constitutional rights. I'm talking about rights that you have in terms of being in the country. What you have as a right living in the country. You have a right to remain in the U.S. indefinitely, at least until the conditions in your home country return to normal. You can receive work permits and various forms of government support. Now, if you notice on the slide there, it is only during the first months in the United States. It's not indefinite. After a year of entry, of course, you can apply for U.S. permanent resident status, which is called a green card, colloquially. And once you get that, after 4 years, you can apply to be a U.S. citizenship, and then you have full rights as a citizen. The same thing with asylees. They can also remain in the U.S. indefinitely until conditions in their home country becomes normal. They can apply for the same work permits as soon as their asylum application is approved. But they cannot do that while they are still in the asylum application process, except in very rare circumstances, perhaps where their cases is taking too long to process, and the lawyer handling the case will make an application, and that could be granted. So it is not quite the same for a refugee. Once you come in, you can get a work permit, within the first months. But for an asylee, you cannot do that while you're still going through the process of the application process, because you can be admitted into the United States if you claim asylum and are allowed to remain in the United States while the process is going on. Now, just like the refugee, after 1 year you can become a permanent resident, and after 4 years of becoming a permanent resident you can apply for U.S. citizenship. Now, there are a number of rights that flow from U.S. immigration policy, U.S. Constitution, and international law that apply to refugees, asylees, deportees, and even detainees, particularly where those detainees are individuals subject to deportation. And what you will find is that those rights derive even from the U.S. immigration policy. They come from protections under the U.S. Constitution, and they also come from international law protections or standards. Now, when you talk about rights, or rights that flow from these three items, the policy of the U.S. immigration laws and the U.S. Constitution and international law protections, you're really talking about legal rights, rights to make certain claims, right to challenge certain actions, things like that. That is different from the right to remain in the United States and work and earn a living and things like that, although those could implicate, some, legal rights. Now, one point I want to make is that, to be fair to Trump and his administration, the U.S. has a long history of violating the civil and human rights of immigrants who often lack political power and access to justice. So most times the debate amongst immigrant rights advocates is whether the battle for immigrants' rights should invoke human rights or civil rights. And what that means is that if you invoke human rights, you're really talking about international law protections and standards, which is a long tradition that goes back, many, many years, and the U.S. is a part of it. However, what you will find as we go through the discussion is that international law standards, when it comes to human rights, don't really, in all cases, have substantive legal foundation under U.S. laws. So you find that the best way to go is to go the route of relying on protections under the U.S. Constitution. However, there are severe restrictions, as we will see when we discuss that. Now, what are the rights that are implicit in the U.S. immigration policy for this group of individuals? The first is the right to family, and then there's a right to due process, and there's a right to freedom from discrimination, and there's a right to freedom from arbitrary detention, there's a right to not experience cruel or unusual punishment. Now, what I've done there, as you can see from the slides, I've tried to place as a corollary amendments of the U.S. Constitution that I would say correlate in some way, not completely, not totally accurately, correlate in some way to some of the rights that flow from the U.S. immigration policy. Now, again, these 5 rights that I list that are implicit in U.S. immigration policy, they exist, in my view, in theory, because in practice, the U.S. does not really practice that, as you will see from our discussion. For instance, the right to be free from arbitrary detention is not, practiced really in the way it should be, because routinely there are deportation raids and things like that, and people are held, for no good cause, and sometimes they are arrested in such a manner that calls into question, the legality, of the arrest and detention, in the first place. But again, these rights are also enshrined in international human rights treaties. However, in U.S. courts of law, those rights have foundation only if they are part of the U.S. Constitution. So those are the rights from the U.S. immigration policy. Now, there are rights that flow from international human rights tradition and standards. But before I talk about that, I need to talk a little bit about how the international human rights organizations view U.S. immigration policy. I've put up there a decision of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, IACHR, that was rendered, I believe, in July of 2010. And that was a case in which involved aspects of U.S. immigration laws regarding the deportation of 2 long-term permanent residents of the United States who were deported. And they brought a claim before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And by the way, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, it's an organ or agency of the Organization of American States, of which the United States is a part of it. As some of you may know, the OAS is by far, I think, the oldest regional organization of nation states or member states. This was set up, I think, started back in 1889 with the first conference in Washington, D.C., and it was not until 1948 that a charter, was drawn up in all places in Bogota, Colombia, and the U.S. is a part of that organization, and they subscribe to the charter, and there are, I believe, 35 members, and the U.S. is one, and even Cuba is one. Cuba became a member since 1962. Well, became a member since its inception, but was excluded in 1962 and joined back again in 2009. So this case was brought by 2 long-term permanent residents against the United States, and at the end of the day, they were deported without due process. They were not given a fair hearing. They were not allowed to show their ties and connection to the United States in that they have been here long term. The U.S. courts did not even consider whether, given their ties to the U.S. and how long they've been in the U.S., whether they still have any ties in their home country. They just simply, deported them, and the crimes that they committed were not very, serious crimes, but they were qualifying crimes under the U.S. immigration policy that makes them subject, to deportation. Now, the court, the commission recommended that the U.S. implement laws to ensure that non-citizens' right to family life as protected under Articles 5, 6, and 7 of the American Declaration are duly protected and given due process on a case-by-case basis in U.S. immigration removal proceedings. Of course, the U.S. says, well, we're sovereign, we have a right to do what we need to do, and nothing has been done to this day as we speak. And that is an example of how the U.S. really does not, in most cases, in their immigration policy, follow the international human rights standards. Now, let's move to protections under the U.S. Constitution. Now, under the U.S. Constitution, foreign nationals who enter the U.S. illegally and remain, they do not have fully protected rights. However, the government simply cannot just do whatever it wishes with them, simply because they're here illegally. Okay? They still have to afford them certain rights. And any decision that has to be made against them has to be something that has to be addressed through Congress. Congress decides most of those issues, what to do with them, whether they're going to remain, border issues, and things like that. But the executive branch has very wide discretion to decide the particulars of enforcing those laws. And what that means is that when the law is now implemented, the executive execute, and in executing it, they could execute it restrictively in such a way to suit the interest of the executive, depending on which executive is in office. However, what is significant is that you cannot simply sweep away the life, liberty, or property from undocumented immigrants just because they lack the proper papers. And if the federal government does that, that could expose them to a civil rights litigation. And also, state governments cannot do that. And if they do that, they could also be exposed to some form of civil rights litigation. I'm going to talk briefly about the kind of civil rights litigation that you can bring against the federal government and those that you can bring against the state government. There's a difference. They all seek the same thing. One is a Bivens action against the federal government, which is a case that goes back to the 1970s, that says that if a federal government official violates your right, that you can sue for money damages in federal court. And for a state government, if a state official, a person who is a state official acting under color of state law violates your right, you can bring what is known as a Section 1983 lawsuit, which is a claim under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983. Those two forms of actions are very broad areas. I'm not really going to get into them in great detail, except where it is necessary to show the kind of remedies and the kind of reliefs that one can obtain if their rights are violated as a recent immigrant or a deportee or even a detainee or a refugee or asylee.